Welcome tonight. We are going to talk about the golden age of piracy. Close your eyes if you wish and let yourself drift back through the centuries to a time when the world's oceans were vast, mysterious frontiers, when the boundaries between nations were drawn not on land but across the rolling waves, and when ordinary men and women could seize their destiny with nothing more than courage, desperation, and a fast ship. Tonight, we journey to the golden age of piracy, that legendary era spanning roughly from the 1650s to the 1730s, when the black flag with its skull and crossbones struck terror into the hearts of merchants and naval officers alike, and when the Caribbean Sea became a stage for some of history's most dramatic and violent struggles for freedom, wealth, and survival. This is not merely a story of treasure and adventure, though both feature prominently in our tale. Rather, it is a complex narrative about class, power, empire, and resistance. It is about what happens when nations wage wars across oceans, when commerce expands faster than law can follow, and when those cast aside by society create their own rough democracy on the margins of the known world. The pirates of this golden age were not the romantic figures of later legend, nor were they simple villains. They were products of their time: deserters, escaped slaves, dispossessed sailors, and adventurers who found in piracy both freedom and fellowship that the legitimate world denied them. Let us begin our journey in the late 17th century, in the warm waters of the Caribbean, where the story of the golden age of piracy truly begins. The seeds of piracy. Europe's imperial ambitions. To understand piracy, we must first understand the world that created it. By the mid-1600s, the great European powers, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands, were locked in a deadly competition for global dominance. The prize they sought was not merely territory, but something far more: valuable control of trade routes and access to the riches of the New World. Spain had been the first to establish a massive empire in the Americas. Following Columbus's voyages and the subsequent conquests of Mexico and Peru, Spanish treasure fleets carried unimaginable wealth back to Europe. Gold and silver plundered from indigenous civilizations, mined by enslaved labor in places like Potosi in modern-day Bolivia. These fleets sailed in convoys, heavily armed and protected, following established routes from Cartagena, Portobello, and Havana back to Seville. The wealth they carried literally changed the economic structure of Europe, fueling inflation, financing wars, and transforming Spain into a global superpower. But Spain's monopoly could not last. England, France, and the Netherlands wanted their share of New World wealth, and they pursued it through a combination of colonization, trade, and what we might call legalized piracy. These nations issued letters of marque and reprisal, legal documents that authorized private ship captains to attack and plunder enemy vessels during wartime. These authorized pirates were called privateers, and they operated in a strange grey zone between legitimate warfare and outright criminality. The distinction between privateer and pirate was often paper-thin. A privateer who attacked only enemy ships in wartime was legal, but when wars ended, and they ended with frequency in this period, suddenly all those armed ships and their experienced crews found themselves without legitimate employment. Many simply continued what they had been doing, except now without government sanction. The privateer became a pirate with the stroke of a pen, with a treaty signed in some distant European capital. The Caribbean provided the perfect environment for this transformation. It was a region of countless islands, hidden coves, and labyrinthine waterways. It was far from the centers of European power, where naval enforcement was weak and often non-existent. It was also home to settlements of buccaneers, the hunters and rovers who lived on the fringes of Spanish territory. smoking meat in the boucan style of the indigenous peoples, and preying on Spanish shipping whenever opportunity arose. These buccaneers were a rough, multicultural society. They included English and French refugees from failed colonies, escaped slaves and indentured servants, native peoples, and adventurers from across Europe. They lived communally, sharing resources and making decisions collectively. Many had no intention of returning to civilized society. They had fled from poverty, oppression, debt, or crime. On the frontier islands of the Caribbean, they found a rough freedom. In the 1650s and 1660s, these buccaneers coalesced around certain strongholds. Port Royal in Jamaica became one of the most notorious. After England captured Jamaica from Spain in 1655, the island became a haven for privateers and former buccaneers who were nominally in English service. The governor of Jamaica, understanding that he lacked the military resources to defend the island against Spanish counterattack, welcomed these armed rovers. They were his navy, his first line of defense, and in exchange for protection and legal sanction, they enriched Jamaica with their plunder. Port Royal grew rich beyond measure. By the 1660s and 1670s, it was one of the wealthiest and most populous English settlements in the Americas. Ships crowded its harbour. Taverns, brothels, and gaming houses lined its streets. Merchants grew wealthy, selling provisions to privateer crews and fencing their stolen goods. It was a city built on plunder, and it acquired a reputation for wickedness that shocked even the morally flexible standards of the 17th century. Among the privateers who made Port Royal their base was a man who would become the most famous of his generation, Henry Morgan. Henry Morgan and the height of buccaneering. Henry Morgan was born in Wales around 1635, likely to a respectable family of modest means. How he came to the Caribbean remains somewhat mysterious. Some sources suggest he was transported as an indentured servant, others that he came as a soldier in England's invasion force. Whatever his origins, by the 1660s Morgan had established himself as a skilled and ruthless privateer captain operating out of Port Royal. Morgan understood something that many of his contemporaries did not, that the real wealth of the Spanish Empire was not on the ships, but in the cities. Spanish treasure fleets were heavily defended and sailed in convoy, making them difficult targets. But the cities of the Spanish Main, Portobello, Maracaibo, Panama, these were vulnerable, and they contained not only gold and silver, but also warehouses full of valuable trade goods. In 1668, Morgan led a fleet of privateers to attack Portobello, one of Spain's most important trading ports on the Isthmus of Panama. The city was defended by 3 substantial forts and garrisoned by Spanish soldiers. Morgan's assault was audacious and brutal. His men used captured priests and nuns as human shields to approach the fortifications. They planted explosive charges, stormed the breaches, and fought hand-to-hand in the streets. The city fell, and Morgan's men spent weeks sacking it, torturing residents to reveal hidden treasure, and drinking the city's wine cellars dry. The raid on Portobello shocked the Spanish colonial administration. This was not simple piracy, it was an organized military assault on a fortified city. Morgan returned to Port Royal as a hero, laden with plunder worth hundreds of thousands of pieces of eight. The governor of Jamaica formally protested the raid to maintain diplomatic appearances with Spain, but privately he celebrated and took his cut of the profits. Morgan's greatest and final expedition came in 1671, when he led a massive force overland across the Isthmus of Panama to attack Panama City itself. This was the Pacific terminus of the Spanish treasure route, where silver from Peru was landed before being transported across the isthmus to the Caribbean for shipment to Spain. It was also one of the wealthiest cities in the New World. The overland march was a nightmare. Morgan's force of nearly 1,400 men struggled through dense jungle and swamps, running short of food and harassed by Spanish defenders. When they finally reached Panama City, they found it defended by a much larger Spanish force that included cavalry and a herd of bulls that the Spanish intended to stampede into the privateer ranks. The battle for Panama City was fierce but decisive. Morgan's buccaneers, despite being outnumbered and exhausted, fought with desperate ferocity. They broke the Spanish lines and stormed into the city. As they did, fires broke out, whether set by the Spanish to deny the privateers their prize, or by the privateers themselves in the chaos of looting, remains disputed. Panama City burned for days, and when the fires finally died, much of the city was destroyed. The plunder from Panama was disappointing relative to the expedition's size and ambition. Much wealth had been evacuated by ship before the privateers arrived, and much had burned in the fires. Morgan's men quarreled over the division of spoils, with many claiming that Morgan had hidden the best treasure for himself. The raid also proved politically catastrophic. Spain and England had signed a peace treaty before the raid, though news had not reached Morgan in time, and Spain demanded satisfaction. Morgan returned to London to face possible prosecution for piracy. Instead, in a stunning reversal, he was knighted by King Charles II and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. His new mission: to suppress the very piracy he had practiced for decades. The age of officially sanctioned buccaneering was ending, but the age of pure piracy was just beginning. Morgan's transformation from buccaneer to pirate hunter reflected a broader shift in European colonial policy. The major powers had divided up much of the Caribbean among themselves through a series of treaties. They now wanted to develop their colonies as profitable trading centers, which required peace, stability, and legitimate commerce. The privateers who had once been useful were now obstacles to this vision of orderly colonialism. But the thousands of armed, experienced sailors who had served under men like Morgan did not simply disappear. They had spent their lives on the account, as piracy was called. They knew no other trade. Many had invested their plunder in drink and women rather than establishing themselves as planters or merchants. When the commissions dried up and the governors turned against them, they had few options. They could accept poverty and obscurity in the colonies, return to Europe and the harsh conditions they had fled, or continue pirating now as outlaws rather than licensed privateers. Many chose piracy. But the Caribbean was becoming increasingly dangerous for pirates as naval patrols intensified, and so they began to look elsewhere for opportunities. Some turned their attention northward to the wealthy colonial ports of North America. Others looked eastward across the Atlantic to the rich trade routes of Africa and the Indian Ocean. The Pirate Round, Madagascar, and the Indian Ocean. While the Caribbean was the cradle of piracy, it was in the Indian Ocean that some pirates found their greatest prizes. The trade routes connecting Europe to India and the Far East carried luxury goods of extraordinary value: silks, spices, jewels, and gold. The ships were often lightly armed compared to the Spanish treasure fleets, and they sailed through regions where European naval power was still tenuous. The journey to the Indian Ocean became known as the Pirate Round. Ships would sail from the Americas, or occasionally directly from Europe, round the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, and then prowl the shipping lanes between India, the Arabian Peninsula, and the East Indies. The island of Madagascar became the primary base for these operations, offering safe harbours, fresh water, and a location far from any European power strong enough to dislodge them. One of the most successful practitioners of the Pirate Round was Henry Every, also known as Henry Avery. In 1694, Every was serving as first mate on a privateering ship in the Spanish West Indies when he led a mutiny, seized the ship, renamed it the Fancy, and set sail for the Indian Ocean. Every was an experienced sailor and a charismatic leader, and he quickly recruited other pirates to join him in a coordinated attack on the Mughal treasure fleet returning from Mecca. In September 1695, Every's small fleet encountered the Ganj-i-Sawai, the flagship of the Mughal fleet and one of the largest and richest ships in the world. After a fierce battle, Every's men boarded the vessel and overwhelmed its defenders. What followed was one of the most lucrative and brutal acts of piracy in history. The pirates plundered treasure worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. Some estimates suggest it was the richest pirate haul ever taken. They also subjected the passengers and crew to extreme violence, including rape and murder. The capture of the Ganj-i-Sawai created an international incident. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb was furious and threatened to expel the English East India Company from India entirely. The company, desperate to maintain its profitable trade monopoly, offered a massive reward for Every's capture and launched an unprecedented manhunt. Every, meanwhile, had sailed back around Africa and disappeared. He supposedly retired in obscurity somewhere in England or Ireland, successfully evading capture and living off his plunder, one of the very few pirates to retire rich and unpunished. Every success inspired others. Throughout the late 1690s and early 1700s, pirates flocked to Madagascar, which became a kind of pirate republic. Ships like the Resolution under John Bowen, the Speedy Return under George Booth, and the Morning Star under William Kidd hunted along the Indian coast and in the Red Sea. Some pirates established relationships with local rulers, offering protection in exchange for safe harbor. Others allegedly intermarried with local populations and established settlements. The most notorious of these Madagascar-based pirates was a man named William Kidd, though his story is more complicated than legend suggests. Kidd was a successful privateer and ship captain who in 1695 was commissioned by a group of wealthy English investors, including several members of the nobility, to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean. He sailed aboard the adventure galley with a letter of marque authorizing him to attack French ships and known pirates. But Kidd's voyage went disastrously wrong. Disease ravaged his crew as they sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. When they reached the Indian Ocean, they found few legitimate prizes. Kidd's crew grew mutinous, demanding that he turn pirate. Under pressure and faced with mounting debts and a restless crew, Kidd began attacking ships indiscriminately, including ships under passes that should have protected them from English attack. The breaking point came when Kidd killed his gunner, William Moore, in a heated argument. Moore had challenged Kidd's decision to attack a ship under an English pass, calling him a lousy dog. Kidd struck Moore with a wooden bucket, fracturing his skull. Moore died the next day. Kidd's most valuable prize was the Quidar Merchant, an Armenian ship carrying a rich cargo of silks, satins, sugar, and other goods. Kidd seized the ship and its cargo, though he later claimed it was a legitimate prize because the ship was sailing under French passes. This technicality would not save him. When news of Kidd's attacks reached England, he was declared a pirate. His powerful backers abandoned him to save their own reputations. Kidd, unaware of how completely the political winds had turned against him, sailed back to North America hoping to negotiate a pardon. He was arrested in Boston in 1699, transported to London and tried for piracy and murder. Kidd's trial was a political spectacle. The government was determined to make an example of him and to prove its commitment to suppressing piracy. Kidd claimed he had acted under pressure from his mutinous crew, and that his prizes were legitimate under his commission. But he was unable to produce the French passes that would have proven his claims. They mysteriously disappeared from his papers. Modern historians have discovered these passes in British archives, suggesting they may have been deliberately suppressed to ensure Kidd's conviction. Kidd was found guilty and hanged at Execution Dock in London on May 23, 1701. The rope broke on the first attempt, leaving Kidd suspended but alive. He was hanged a second time successfully. His body was then coated in tar and displayed in a gibbet at the mouth of the Thames River as a warning to other sailors. The famous pirate captain, who may have been more victim than villain, became a symbol of the government's determination to end the pirate menace. But Kidd's execution did not end piracy in the Indian Ocean. Madagascar remained a pirate haven for another decade, and the pirate round continued to attract desperate men seeking fortune. It would take sustained naval operations and the gradual extension of European naval power into the Indian Ocean before this route finally became too dangerous to sustain regular pirate operations. The Golden Age in the Atlantic, Nassau and the Flying Gang. While the Indian Ocean offered rich prizes, it was the Atlantic and Caribbean that saw the full flowering of piracy in the early 18th century. The end of the War of Spanish Succession in 1713 released thousands of privateers into unemployment. The Royal Navy demobilized, dismissing experienced sailors with no prospects. Meanwhile, the growth of colonial trade meant that more ships than ever were crossing the Atlantic, many of them poorly defended merchantmen carrying valuable cargoes. The pirates needed a base, and they found one in an unlikely place: New Providence Island in the Bahamas. The island had been briefly settled by the English, but was largely abandoned after Spanish and French attacks. Its principal settlement, Nassau, sat on an excellent natural harbour but lacked any substantial government or military presence. Into this power vacuum sailed the pirates. By 1715, Nassau had become a pirate republic. Hundreds of pirates made it their home base, careening their ships on its beaches, drinking in its taverns, and selling their plunder. They established a rough democratic society, electing their own leaders and making collective decisions about strategy and targets. The most influential figures in this flying gang, as they became known, included Benjamin Hornigold, Henry Jennings, and a young sailor who would become the most famous pirate of all, Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. Blackbeard remains the archetypal pirate of popular imagination, and with good reason. Everything about him was calculated to terrify. He was a tall, powerful man with a wild black beard that he allegedly wove into braids and adorned with ribbons. In battle, he would put slow-burning fuses under his hat, wreathing his face in smoke like a demon from hell. He carried multiple pistols and swords. His flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was a former French slave ship that he had captured and outfitted with 40 guns, making it one of the most powerful pirate vessels of the age. But Blackbeard was more than just intimidating appearance. He was a skilled navigator and tactician who understood that a fearsome reputation was itself a weapon. If ships surrendered at the sight of his flag, there was no need for costly battles that might damage valuable cargo or kill potential crew members. Terror was good for business. Blackbeard's career as a pirate captain lasted less than 2 years, from 1716 to 1718, but he packed those years with audacious raids. He terrorized the shipping lanes of the Carolinas and Virginia, blockaded Charleston Harbor, and ransomed the city, and sailed as far north as Delaware Bay. He captured numerous prizes and accumulated a significant treasure. He also demonstrated the brutal realities of pirate life. When provisions ran short, he marooned crew members on deserted islands. He once shot his own quartermaster, Israel Hands, in the knee during a drinking session, reportedly to remind them who he was. His treatment of prisoners varied from professional and almost courteous to sadistic and cruel, depending on whether they resisted or cooperated. In 1718, Blackbeard attempted to negotiate a pardon from the governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden. England had offered a general pardon to pirates who surrendered by a certain date, part of a carrot-and-stick approach to ending piracy. Blackbeard apparently received his pardon and for a time attempted to retire to Bath, North Carolina. But he could not stay away from piracy, whether because he missed the life or because he had been so profligate with his plunder that he needed more, and he soon returned to raiding. The governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, decided that Blackbeard was too dangerous to be allowed to continue. Unable to arrest him in North Carolina, where Governor Eden apparently protected him, Spotswood authorized a naval expedition to hunt down the pirate. He placed Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy in command of 2 sloops and ordered him to find and kill Blackbeard. On November 22, 1718, Maynard found Blackbeard's sloop, the Adventure, anchored at Ocracoke Inlet in North Carolina. The battle that followed became the stuff of legend. Maynard's ships ran aground on sandbars approaching the inlet, forcing him to wait for the tide. Blackbeard, confident in his superior position, allegedly spent the evening drinking and boasted that he would give no quarter in the coming battle. At dawn, the battle began. Blackbeard's crew poured devastating fire into Maynard's ships. Maynard, realizing he could not win a firefight, ordered most of his men below decks to make it appear his crew had been decimated. Blackbeard, seeing the apparently empty deck, maneuvered alongside to board. It was a fatal mistake. Maynard's men erupted from below, and fierce hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Blackbeard and Maynard met in single combat. They fired their pistols at each other. Blackbeard's shot missed. Maynard struck home but did not stop the pirate. They drew swords and fought. Maynard's sword broke. Blackbeard was poised to deliver the killing blow when one of Maynard's men slashed him across the throat from behind. Even this did not stop Blackbeard immediately. Accounts say he fought on, bleeding from numerous wounds, before finally collapsing. Maynard later reported that Blackbeard's body bore 5 pistol wounds and more than 20 cuts from swords and knives. Maynard severed Blackbeard's head and hung it from his ship's bowsprit as he sailed back to Virginia, proof of the kill and a warning to other pirates. Blackbeard's death marked a turning point, but Nassau remained a pirate stronghold. The British government, increasingly concerned about the threat to commerce, appointed Woodes Rogers as governor of the Bahamas, with orders to suppress piracy by any means necessary. Rogers was himself a former privateer who had circumnavigated the globe and captured a Spanish treasure galleon, so he understood the pirate mentality. Rogers arrived in Nassau in 1718 with a naval escort and a royal pardon for any pirate who surrendered. He found a town full of pirates. Estimates suggest somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 were present. Many accepted the pardon, including Benjamin Hornigold, who became a pirate hunter in Rogers' service. But others, led by Charles Vane, refused. Vane loaded a captured ship with explosives, set it alight, and sailed it toward Rogers' fleet as they entered the harbour. The fireship forced Rogers to scatter temporarily, and Vane escaped to continue his pirate career. Rogers began the work of establishing legitimate government in Nassau. He fortified the harbour, recruited a militia, and granted land to former pirates willing to become settlers. It was an uphill battle. The former pirates resented authority. Disease was rampant. Spanish forces attacked, hoping to reclaim the island. And some of those who had accepted the pardon soon returned to piracy, unable or unwilling to adapt to settled life. The most dramatic test came when Charles Vane returned to attack Nassau. Rogers's defense held and Vane was forced to retreat. But the incident demonstrated that the transition from pirate haven to legitimate colony would not be easy. It would take years of sustained effort, including naval patrols, public executions, and economic development, before Nassau was truly pacified. The Pirate Code. Democracy and discipline on the account. To understand the Golden Age pirates, we must understand how they organized themselves, for pirate ships were remarkable social experiments in democracy and egalitarianism, at a time when the rest of society was rigidly hierarchical. Life aboard a naval or merchant ship in the early 18th century was harsh and authoritarian. Captains had absolute power. They could order floggings for minor infractions, and they often did. Food was poor and sometimes deliberately short-rationed, with officers eating better than ordinary sailors. Pay was low and often delayed or embezzled by corrupt pursers. Discipline was maintained through violence and the threat of violence. Sailors were essentially property subject to impressment, forced naval service, and they had no legal recourse against abuse. Pirate ships operated on entirely different principles. When men turned pirate, they entered into a written compact called the Articles, which laid out the rules of their association. These articles varied from ship to ship, but they shared common features that were strikingly democratic and egalitarian. First, officers were elected. The crew chose their captain, quartermaster, and other officers by majority vote. More importantly, they could remove these officers by vote if they proved incompetent or tyrannical. The captain's authority was supreme only in battle or chase. At other times, major decisions were made collectively by the crew. Second, loot was divided according to a fixed scale. The captain and key officers received larger shares, but not vastly larger. Typically, the captain got 2 shares to an ordinary crewman's 1, while in merchant and naval ships the disparity was far greater. Every man had a vote on how prizes should be disposed of, whether to risk attacking a particular ship, and where to sail. Third, the Articles established rules of conduct and discipline. Fighting among the crew was forbidden. Disputes had to be settled ashore or by vote. Drunkenness while on watch, desertion and cowardice in battle all carried penalties. Punishments were decided collectively and clearly spelled out in advance. Fourth, the Articles provided a form of disability insurance. Men who lost limbs in battle received set compensation, typically 800 pieces of 8 for a right arm, 600 for a left arm, and similar amounts for legs or eyes. This was revolutionary. Maimed sailors in the merchant service were simply cast ashore with no support. The Articles of Captain Bartholomew Roberts's ships, which survive, give us a detailed picture of this pirate democracy. Article 1 stated that every man had an equal vote in affairs of the moment, an equal title to fresh provisions or strong liquors seized, using them at pleasure unless a scarcity made it necessary to vote for a retrenchment. Article 2 established the division of prize money according to a clear scale. Article 3 forbid gambling for money among the crew. Article 4 specified that lights and candles were to be out at 8 o'clock, and if any crew members desired to drink after that hour, they must sit on the open deck. Article 5 mandated that men keep their weapons clean and ready for action. Article 6 forbid boys and women on board, with death as the penalty for seducing a woman and bringing her on board in disguise. Article 7 specified that desertion in battle or at quarters would be punished by death or marooning. Article 8 forbids striking another crew member on board, requiring disputes to be settled ashore by sword or pistol, according to formal duelling rules. Article 9 promised disability compensation. 800 pieces of 8 for the loss of a limb, proportionately less for lesser wounds. Article X gave the captain and quartermaster 2 shares of a prize, other officers a share and a quarter, and ordinary seamen 1 share each. Article 15 mandated that musicians had rest on Sundays but were required to work the other 6 days. These articles created a society far more egalitarian than any the pirates would have known. The pirate ship was a floating republic in an age of monarchies, a workplace democracy in an era of absolute authority, and a welfare state providing disability benefits before any nation had conceived of such a thing. This democratic character extended to other aspects of pirate life. Decisions about targets, strategy, and destinations were made by vote. Captains who became too cautious or too reckless could be removed. Food was shared equally, with officers eating the same rations as ordinary crew. Punishments required the consent of the company. The role of quartermaster was particularly important in this system. While the captain commanded in battle, the quartermaster represented the crew's interests at other times. He distributed food and supplies, settled disputes, and often led boarding parties. He was a check on the captain's power, and many pirate articles specified that the quartermaster could veto certain of the captain's decisions. This is not to romanticize pirate society. These were violent, often cruel men operating outside the law. They raided, killed, and sometimes tortured. The democracy they practiced extended only to their own crews, not to their victims. But within their own communities, they created forms of social organization that were genuinely radical for their time. Many pirates were escaped slaves or former slave ship sailors who had seen the horrors of the Middle Passage. Pirate crews were multiracial in composition, including white Europeans, black Africans, indigenous Americans, and mixed-race individuals. While racial prejudice certainly existed, pirate ships were far more integrated than legitimate society. A skilled sailor could rise based on ability rather than race, and men of color served as captains, quartermasters, and crew members on equal terms. Women also found their way onto pirate ships, though they were rarer. The most famous female pirates were Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who sailed with Captain John Calico Jack Rackham. Both dressed as men and were reportedly as fierce and capable as any male pirate. When Rackham's ship was finally captured in 1720, witnesses testified that Bonny and Read were among the few crew members who fought bravely, while most of the men hid below decks, too drunk to resist. Mary Read's background illustrates the desperation that drove many to piracy. Born illegitimate in England, she was raised dressed as a boy so her mother could collect support meant for an older brother who had died. She served in the military disguised as a man, married a fellow soldier, but was widowed. She went to sea, again disguised, and her ship was captured by Calico Jack's pirates. She joined the crew, eventually revealing her identity to Anne Bonny, and the two became close companions and fierce fighters. When Rackham's crew was tried for piracy, Read and Bonny both pleaded their bellies, claimed to be pregnant, which under English law prevented their execution until after they gave birth. Red died in prison, probably from fever. Bonny's fate remains unknown. She simply disappears from the historical record after the trial. Some accounts claim her wealthy father bought her freedom. She may have returned to a quiet life, or she may have died in prison like Read. We will never know. The Pirate Code, with its democracy and rough justice, represented a conscious rejection of legitimate society. These men had experienced the brutality, inequality, and arbitrary power of the naval and merchant services. They had seen shipmates flogged bloody for minor infractions. They had watched corrupt officers embezzle their wages. They had endured hunger while officers dined well. and they had concluded that they would rather be outlaws living under their own rules than continue accepting such treatment. Black Bart, the greatest pirate of them all. If Blackbeard was the most famous pirate, Bartholomew Roberts was arguably the most successful. During his brief 3-year career from 1719 to 1722, Roberts captured over 400 ships, more than any other pirate of the Golden Age. He was also a study in contradictions, a pious man who forbade gambling and required Sunday church services, yet utterly ruthless with those who opposed him. Roberts did not choose piracy, it chose him. In 1719, he was serving as second mate on a slave ship when it was captured by pirates led by Howell Davis off the coast of West Africa. Davis was an experienced pirate who had been active in the Caribbean and Atlantic. He recognized Roberts's navigational skills and forced him to join the pirate crew. When Davis was killed in an ambush by the Portuguese a few weeks later, the crew elected Roberts as captain. It was an unusual choice. Roberts had been with them less than 6 weeks, but the crew recognized his abilities and his forceful personality. Roberts was reluctant at first, reportedly saying that since he had dipped his hands in muddy water and must be a pirate, it was better being a commander than a common man. Roberts proved to be a natural pirate commander. Unlike many pirates who were content to raid coastal vessels and small prizes, Roberts thought strategically about where the richest targets could be found. He sailed to Brazil, where he knew that a Portuguese treasure fleet would soon depart. In early 1720, he captured the Sagrada Familia, a Portuguese ship carrying 40,000 gold coins and a cargo of sugar, hides, and tobacco. It was one of the richest prizes taken during the entire Golden Age. But Roberts wanted more than wealth. He wanted respect and revenge. When the governor of Martinique sent 2 ships to hunt him, Roberts captured them both. He then created a personal flag featuring himself standing on 2 skulls labeled ABH and AMH, a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head, his revenge on those who had dared oppose him. Roberts developed a reputation for discipline and efficiency unusual among pirates. He enforced his articles strictly. He banned women from his ships. He forbade gambling. He required regular church services. Men who violated the articles faced harsh punishment. Yet he was also capable of shocking cruelty. When he captured the King Solomon, whose captain had cooperated with pirate hunters, Roberts hanged the captain from his own yardarm. His career reached its height between 1720 and 1721, when he terrorized the Caribbean and the Atlantic coast of Africa. He captured ships of all nations, English, Portuguese, French, Dutch, showing no favoritism. His flagship, the Royal Fortune, was one of the most powerful pirate vessels ever, mounting 42 guns. He commanded a fleet of smaller vessels and a crew of several hundred men. Roberts's success attracted the attention of the Royal Navy. The Admiralty dispatched HMS Swallow under Captain Challoner Ogle, specifically to hunt Roberts down. Ogle was an experienced and determined officer who spent months searching for Roberts along the African coast. On February 10, 1722, Ogle finally found Roberts's fleet anchored at Cape Lopez in present-day Gabon. Roberts had just captured a slave ship and was in the process of fitting it out when the Swallow appeared. Roberts's consort ship, the Ranger, immediately gave chase, thinking the Swallow was a merchant vessel. It was a fatal mistake. The Swallow led the Ranger out of sight of the rest of the fleet, then turned and engaged her in battle. After a fierce fight, the Ranger surrendered. Ogle then returned for Roberts's flagship, the Royal Fortune. Roberts, who had been drinking with his crew when the Swallow appeared, quickly prepared for battle. But many of his men were drunk, and Roberts had been too confident in his position, anchored in a supposedly safe haven. The battle was brief. The Swallow opened fire. Roberts, dressed in his finest clothes, a crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, a red feather in his hat, a gold chain with a diamond cross around his neck, stood on the quarterdeck directing the defence. A grape-shot volley from the Swallow struck him in the throat, killing him instantly. His men, following his wishes, threw his body overboard before surrendering. Roberts had reportedly said he would rather be buried in the sea than hang at the gallows, and his crew honoured that request. The most successful pirate of the Golden Age disappeared into the waves off the African coast. His body never recovered. The captured crews of the Royal Fortune and the Ranger were transported to Cape Coast Castle, where they faced trial. Of the 254 pirates captured, 54 were hanged. 37 were sentenced to servitude in Africa, 70 were sent to merchant ships, and the rest were acquitted or died in prison. It was one of the largest mass executions of pirates in history and marked a decisive shift in the war against piracy. The end of an era, suppression and legacy. Roberts's death was not the end of Golden Age piracy, but it was the beginning of the end. By the early 1720s, the Golden Age was entering its final phase. The factors that had allowed piracy to flourish were disappearing. The European powers had established more effective colonial governments. Naval patrols had intensified. Pirate havens like Nassau had been suppressed. And the general pardon offered by England in 1718 had persuaded many pirates to abandon the account. Moreover, the Royal Navy had developed more effective tactics for suppressing piracy. Rather than relying on large warships that were too slow to catch pirate vessels, the Navy deployed fast frigates and sloops specifically designed to hunt pirates. Captains like Chaloner Ogle were given standing orders to pursue pirates relentlessly, without regard for colonial boundaries or diplomatic niceties. The trials of captured pirates also became increasingly theatrical and severe. The Admiralty wanted to make examples of pirates to deter others. Pirates were tried in special Admiralty courts, often far from where they had been captured, and the proceedings were publicized widely. Convicted pirates were hanged at special execution docks, their bodies sometimes displayed in gibbets as warnings. The message was clear: piracy would not be tolerated. Yet piracy continued in diminished form throughout the 1720s. Edward Lowe, one of the most sadistic pirates of the era, terrorized the Atlantic coast and Caribbean from 1721 to 1724. Lowe was notorious for his cruelty. He once cut off a captain's lips, broiled them, and forced the man to eat them. He tortured prisoners routinely and killed for pleasure. Even other pirates considered him excessively brutal. He disappeared in 1724, possibly killed by his own crew or possibly marooned. His fate remains unknown. Philip Lyne was another late Golden Age pirate who operated in the Caribbean and Atlantic. He was eventually captured and hanged in 1726. Francis Spriggs operated in the Caribbean and off Honduras until approximately 1725, when he too disappeared. One by one, the famous pirate captains were killed, captured, or vanished. The last great pirate of the Golden Age was arguably Olivier Levasseur, known as La Bouse, the Buzzard, a French pirate who operated in the Indian Ocean. In 1721, he captured the Nossa Senhora do Cabo, a Portuguese treasure ship, taking what may have been one of the largest treasures ever seized by pirates. Legend says that Levasseur hid his treasure on an island in the Indian Ocean, and that he threw a cryptogram into the crowd at his execution in 1730, shouting, "Find my treasure if you can." The treasure has never been found, and treasure hunters search for it, still. By 1730, the Golden Age was effectively over. The combination of naval suppression, pardons, and improved colonial governance had largely eliminated piracy from the Atlantic and Caribbean. Some piracy continued in the Indian Ocean for a few more years, but even there it gradually faded as European naval power extended further east. The reasons for piracy's decline were multiple. Improved naval patrols made piracy more dangerous and less profitable. The elimination of safe havens meant pirates had fewer places to refit, resupply, and sell prizes. Economic opportunities improved in the colonies, giving sailors alternatives to piracy. The massive executions of the 1720s demonstrated that governments were serious about suppression. And perhaps most importantly, the wars that had created thousands of unemployed privateers ended, cutting off the main source of new pirates. 3. The Pirate Legacy: Myth and Reality. The Golden Age pirates left a complex legacy. In their own time, they were seen primarily as criminals and enemies of commerce. Merchants cursed them, governments hunted them, moralists condemned them as the worst sort of outlaws. Yet even in the 18th century, there was a fascination with pirates that went beyond simple condemnation. Within a few years of the Golden Age's end, books about pirates became bestsellers. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, was enormously popular and went through multiple editions. Johnson, whose real identity remains disputed, some scholars believe it was Daniel Defoe, provided detailed and largely accurate accounts of the famous pirates, though he also included some fictional elements and moral commentary. His book shaped how subsequent generations would view pirates. In the 19th century, pirates became increasingly romanticized. Writers like Robert Louis Stevenson in Treasure Island and J.M. Barrie in Peter Pan created fictional pirates who were adventurous, rogues rather than brutal criminals. The reality of pirate torture, murder, and violence faded, replaced by images of buried treasure, desert islands, and dashing outlaws. The Jolly Roger became a symbol not of terror, but of adventure. This romanticization continued into the 20th and 21st centuries with films like the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, which presents pirates as lovable scoundrels fighting against oppressive authority. Modern pirate reenactors celebrate pirate culture at festivals and events. Pirates have become figures of fun, rebellion and freedom rather than violence and crime. But this romanticization obscures important historical truths. The real pirates of the Golden Age were products of brutal economic and social conditions. Many were desperate men who saw piracy as their only option for survival and autonomy. They created genuinely democratic and egalitarian societies on their ships. But these were islands of democracy in a sea of violence. They fought against oppressive labor conditions and authoritarian power structures, but they did so through robbery, murder, and terror. Modern historians have tried to recover the real pirates from beneath the layers of myth. Scholars like Marcus Rediker have examined piracy as a form of social rebellion, arguing that pirates were proto-revolutionaries who rejected the hierarchies of their time. Others, like David Cordingley, have focused on separating historical fact from fictional embellishment. Still others have examined piracy in the context of the Atlantic world's economic systems, seeing pirates as actors in the larger drama of colonialism, slavery, and global trade. What emerges from this scholarship is a more nuanced picture. Pirates were not simple villains or heroes. They were complex individuals operating in complex circumstances. Some were genuinely brutal psychopaths like Edward Lowe. Others were essentially forced into piracy like Bartholomew Roberts. Some sought wealth. Others sought freedom. Some were escaped slaves fighting against the systems that had enslaved them. Others were opportunists exploiting whatever advantages they could find. The pirate democracy, while real, was also limited. Pirates extended equality and democratic governance to their own crews, but showed no such consideration to their victims. Their egalitarianism was bounded by their own community. Outside it, they were often as ruthless and hierarchical as any merchant captain or naval officer. The pirate ship was a refuge for those excluded from legitimate society, but it was built on violence and sustained by plunder. Yet the appeal of pirates persists, and for understandable reasons. The pirates of the Golden Age represented a challenge to authority at a time when authority was absolute. They demonstrated that alternatives to rigid social hierarchies were possible, even if those alternatives were ultimately unsustainable. They showed that ordinary sailors could govern themselves collectively and share wealth equitably. They proved that individuals could resist seemingly overwhelming power structures, even if only temporarily. The pirates also embodied a certain defiant individualism. They rejected the fate society had assigned them: poverty, brutality, early death, and seized control of their own destinies. They lived dangerously but on their own terms. This appeals to something deep in the human psyche, the desire for autonomy and self-determination, even when we know rationally that piracy is neither romantic nor admirable. The wider context: piracy in the Age of Empire. To fully understand the Golden Age pirates, we must place them in the broader context of the 17th and 18th centuries, an era of massive global transformation. This was the age when Europe established dominance over much of the world through colonization, trade, and military power. It was also the age of the Atlantic slave trade, which transported millions of Africans to the Americas in one of history's greatest crimes. Pirates were both products of this system and challengers to it. Many had served on slave ships and witnessed the horrors of the Middle Passage. Some, like Christopher Moody and Thomas Cochrane, are recorded as having freed enslaved Africans from captured ships and invited them to join their crews. Others continued the slave trade or sold enslaved people they had captured. The pirate relationship with slavery was complex and contradictory. Similarly, pirates both depended on and disrupted colonial commerce. They needed the growing Atlantic trade to provide targets and markets for stolen goods. Yet their predations threatened that same trade, raising insurance costs and forcing merchants to arm their ships more heavily. Colonial governors sometimes welcomed pirates when they needed military support against rival powers, but condemned them when peace and commerce became priorities. The Golden Age pirates operated in a world being transformed by capitalism, imperialism, and the early stages of industrialization. Traditional ways of life were being disrupted. People were being displaced from rural areas and forced into wage labor or military service. The oceanic commons, the seas that had been relatively free spaces, were being claimed and controlled by nation-states and their navies. Piracy can be seen as a form of resistance to these processes. Pirates reclaimed the oceanic commons as free spaces. They rejected wage labor in favor of collective enterprise. They distributed wealth more equitably than the emerging capitalist economy. They created multiracial, democratic communities in defiance of the racial and political hierarchies of the colonial world. But piracy was also deeply implicated in the very systems it challenged. Pirates sold their plunder in colonial ports. They depended on the same global trade networks they disrupted. Some enriched themselves through the same exploitative practices. They had fled. The pirate challenge to empire and capitalism was real, but ultimately contained within the larger systems. This ambiguity makes pirates difficult to categorize politically. They were neither purely revolutionary nor purely reactionary. They were adapting to and resisting the emerging modern world in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. This may explain why they continue to fascinate us. They embodied the tensions and contradictions of their era in particularly dramatic form. Conclusion: the end of the account. As we near the end of our journey through the golden age of piracy, let us return once more to those warm Caribbean waters where our story began. Imagine yourself on the deck of a merchant vessel in the year 1730. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Your ship is bound for London with a cargo of sugar and rum. You scan the horizon nervously, looking for suspicious sails. But the horizon is empty. The pirate menace that had terrified these waters for decades has faded. Nassau is now a respectable British colony. The famous pirate captains are dead or disappeared. The Royal Navy patrols regularly. Commerce flows more freely than it has in a generation. You feel a mixture of relief and something else, perhaps a faint sense of loss. The stories of Blackbeard, Black Bart, Calico Jack, and the rest will be told for generations. They have already become legends, and you know that in time, the violence and terror will fade from memory, leaving only the romance and adventure. The golden age of piracy lasted roughly 80 years, from the 1650s to the 1730s. In that span, thousands of men and some women turned pirate, rejecting legitimate society for a life of freedom and peril. They created democratic communities on their ships. They challenged the naval and commercial power of empires. They accumulated treasure and spent it lavishly. They terrorized honest merchants and fought desperate battles against naval forces sent to suppress them. Most died young, hanged at the gallows, killed in battle, or succumbing to disease in tropical climates. Very few retired rich. Their lives were, in Thomas Hobbes's famous phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. Yet they lived on their own terms in a way that most of their contemporaries could never imagine. They were free in ways that ordinary sailors, merchants, and even gentlemen were not. The Golden Age ended because the world changed. The European powers established more effective control over their colonies. Naval technology and tactics improved. Economic opportunities expanded, providing alternatives to piracy. And the massive efforts to suppress piracy, the naval patrols, the executions, the destruction of pirate havens, eventually succeeded. But the memory of the pirates endured. They became legends, symbols of freedom and rebellion, of adventure and danger. The Jolly Roger, that black flag with its skull and crossbones, became one of history's most recognizable symbols. Pirates entered folklore, literature, and eventually film and popular culture, transformed from criminals into heroes of a sort. Today we know more about the historical reality of pirates than ever before. Scholarly research has recovered their stories from archives, court records, and contemporary accounts. We understand the economic and social forces that created piracy and eventually destroyed it. We know the articles they wrote, the ships they sailed, the battles they fought, and the deaths they died. Yet the appeal of pirates persists beyond historical knowledge. They represent something fundamental: the desire for autonomy, the rejection of unjust authority, the possibility of creating alternative societies. In an age of nations and corporations, of complex hierarchies and systems, the pirate ship stands as a reminder that other ways of organizing society are possible. The Golden Age pirates were not heroes. They were violent criminals who stole, killed, and terrorized. But they were also men and women trapped in brutal circumstances who created brief moments of freedom and equality in an unfree and unequal world. They challenged empires with nothing but courage, skill, and desperation. They lived more vividly in their short years than most people do in long lifetimes. As we end our journey tonight, remember that history is never simple. The pirates were not what legend makes them, but they were not simple villains either. They were human beings living in difficult times, making choices both brave and terrible, creating and destroying, living and dying under that black flag. The golden age of piracy is long over. The oceans are no longer free spaces where outcasts can create their own societies. The world has moved on, and perhaps that is for the best. Piracy brought suffering and death along with its romance and freedom. But on quiet nights, when the moon reflects off calm Caribbean waters, you might imagine you hear the ghost of a pirate song drifting across the waves. You might imagine sails on the horizon, black against the stars, and feel a strange pull toward that vanished world of freedom and peril. And in that moment, you understand why the golden age of piracy continues to captivate us, centuries after the last pirate captain fell. The account is closed. The pirates are gone. But their story remains a complex and troubling and thrilling chapter in human history, one that reminds us that the desire for freedom and autonomy is timeless, even when the methods of pursuing it are deeply flawed. Rest now. Dream, if you wish, of distant seas and forgotten islands, of treasure and adventure, of freedom bought at a terrible price. The golden age of piracy has ended, but its memory sails on, black flags flying into the eternal night.